Hi everyone, welcome back to Winging It. Thanks so much for tuning in again. My name's Rebecca and we are in our fourth week of making our January panel. So if you're new here and you don't know what's going on, I will link a playlist at the top of the screen here so that you can go and watch all of the videos in this series. There are only 3 before this one, so there's not loads of watching. We are making a panel throughout each month this year. That's our Winging It project for the year. And for January, we are making a landscape that reflects the weather and environment wherever in the world we're located. So I'm based in Lincolnshire in the UK, where it is winter and it has been extremely wet and extremely cold, and we are dealing with lots of flooding in our fields. So in week 1 we painted our background and then we laid the landscape pieces and we added some chiffon ribbon in places to reflect the flooded fields that are all around Lincolnshire. And then in week 2 we added some dynamic stitch, so we were looking at how we could add movement and texture into our landscape by using quite simple stitch techniques. Last week we added our tree using some couching, and we did a new technique that we've not done before on Winging It to create our owl, and if you want to know more about that you'll have to go and watch the video. And so this week we are going to finish this off, and I've got some tips for trimming it back. I'm going to do something with the edges to make this easy to link to our other panels, and we're going to put in some foreground and some rain as well. So that's where we're heading, and so let's get into it. I'm just going to gather my bits and pieces and we'll get started. Okay, so I've gathered up some bits and pieces and I'll just sort of explain the kinds of things that we're going to use today so that you've got an idea of where we're heading. So I've got a whole bunch of different coloured threads and different textures of thread. I think I probably won't use any wool today, but I've got different weights of threads here, all in our colour schemes. I've got lots of blues, I've got some darker ones, I've got some just stranded cotton as well as some perlays in there, and then there's some of this lovely textured thread and some perlay, some linen thread in there. I've got some metallics as well. Then I've got a bunch of beads and sequins because I think I'm going to add some details to the foreground, and I want to try and capture the wetness of January in Lincolnshire and the cold as well, so I want it to look frosty. And so I've got all sorts of beads here. I've got more out of shot, so I've got some blues as well that I might bring in. And then finally I've got some iridescent sequins there as well, and just some glassy pale blue beads that are too big normally to use on things, but I think they might work quite well on this. And then finally I've got some bias binding. So this is binding that I made for a quilt that I made for my daughter, and what I'm planning on doing is binding the edges so that we've got a nice outline to our piece of work. And that does mean that because I'll have a fold over the binding at the edge, it will be easy to attach this panel to another panel to either make a concertina book or a wall hanging, which is what I'm planning on doing. So they're the kinds of things that you need. Obviously I'm working with my colour scheme, but if you're watching in the southern hemisphere or somewhere a lot warmer than the UK, then you might need to think about the different effects that you want to create in your piece and gather some bits and pieces accordingly. So I'm starting off with some Sheepy's navy blue. It is called ultramarine. It's shade 124. I'll try and share shades if I can, but don't have shades on every thread I've got. So what I'm going to do is start over on this side, and I'm using my lines as a guide, and what I want to do is just create some sense of like grasses and things like that. So you can do this in loads of different ways. I'm going to start with a pistol stitch. So I've brought my thread up from the back, and a pistol stitch is just a French knot on a stick. So if you're not sure how to do that, I've got my needle horizontal, and I'm going to take my thread over the top of the needle, and I'm going to wrap it round twice. And if I was doing a French knot, I would go back to very close to where the thread came out and pull that tight around my needle. But this time I want to make it go a little bit further away. So I'm just going to take my thread down over here. So you can see I've got the stick, wrapped my thread, and I've gone down right over here. Now I'm pulling that fairly taut, not tight, but taut, so that there's no slack on the thread, and I'm going to take that back through. Now if I was creating proper French knots, I would be wanting this to be perfectly tight, but on this occasion I actually don't mind if my knots go a little bit loopy. So I've just come up again, and I'm going to put in another pistol stitch over here. Now some of these are going to be quite hard to see initially. I'm not worried about that at all. So I'm just going to add some stitches along maybe a third of the way along the front, and I'm just going to sort of clump them a little bit sometimes and let them land where they will. So this is all about not having to think too much. I'm just going to do some repetitive stitching just to be quite mindful, and I want them to crisscross over each other. So I might have one just going a little bit in the other direction. I want these to look haphazard, and these are going to look vaguely like seed heads. What you don't want to do is completely cover up what you've already put in place. So I'm just leaving plenty of space so that my standing water can be seen. I think I've wrapped that 3 times. No big deal. That's going to be too straight. So I don't want to overthink it, but I don't want everything looking like soldiers standing in a line. So let's have one going at a jaunty angle back across that one. And then let's have, just with our last little bit of thread remaining, let's have quite a short one. There we go. Now I tend not to use a hoop for this, but if you are worried about your stitches pulling, if you're worried about your tension and puckering up your piece of fabric, then by all means put it in a hoop. Do whatever's helpful to you. So that's the first stitch that we're going to play with. So I've got some more sheepish thread here. I've already knotted the end, and another stitch that you can play with, this one is spruce 244. Having a microphone malfunction there. So this one we are going to have a play with some fly stitch. So again, we've used fly stitch before. We used it over here. That's one that's sort of V-shaped with an anchor stitch, but you can extend that anchor stitch to make a bit of a stalk. So let's have some fly stitches coming in now. So I'm bringing my thread up, I'm hopping across horizontally, I don't want it too big, so I'm taking my needle back down horizontally across from where the thread came up, and that makes a loop. And what I want to do is rock my needle so that it comes up over that looped thread, and when I pull through, I catch my thread like that and it forms a V shape, and then I can just put a stalk, as long as I like, down to wherever I want the stalk to land. Now that's quite a long stitch, and if you're worried about it flapping about, you can always just put a little couching stitch. So I'm just going back up at the back, and I'm going to put a little stitch that hops over that thread just to couch it down. So yeah, I've just put a little tiny couching stitch. You can't see it at all, but it will just stop that thread from flapping about too much. You can do that with these ones if you want to, but they're not so long that it's going to be a problem. And so I'm going to put some fly stitches in there. So in my part of the world, the vegetation that tends to be around is obviously grasses, and there are quite a lot of seed heads. So we get teasels, and which is like the little spiky hedgehog things on sticks, and I think goldfinches like teasels. They like the seeds, and that's pretty much it. Occasionally you will see some jasmine, but there's definitely very little colour around at this time of the year. It's all very sort of muted, dark things. Lots of fallen leaves that just sit. So we're just trying to create a sense of vegetation, and I'm just showing the stitches that I'm going to use. I will do more work on this, but I'm not going to make you sit through everything I do because that will be interminable. So yeah, I'm just giving you some ideas. So I'm just stitching until I've run out of thread, and then I'll either pick up the same thread again and put it somewhere else, or I will choose a different thread and a different stitch, and you can mix it up. You can do different stitches in the same thread, or you can keep one stitch per thread. It's entirely up to you, and you want to make sure everything overlaps everything because we want this to look organic. So there I've put a fly stitch over those pistol stitches that I'd already made. You can see it's a right mess on the back. It's not a problem. This is not about finishing it perfectly. It's not going to be mounted in a hoop, and that padding, the quilt batting that we've used underneath, kind of absorbs any lumps and bumps. So it's very forgiving when you are stitching with quilt batting as your background or your backing fabric, because it kind of absorbs, it's poofy, so it absorbs any lumps and bumps, so your knots just get hidden away. So you can see I've got some vegetation starting to form there. So another one I like to do for vegetation is an elongated chain stitch. So again, this one's quite hard to see because the threads are very similar colour to the background. I'll do it a couple of times. So I've brought my thread through. This is very similar to fly stitch, but this time, rather than taking my needle away, I'm going back down where my thread comes through the fabric to create a loop. Yeah, there's my loop. Let me pull the loop closer so you can see it. There's my loop. Then I want to come down a little way inside that loop, and when I pull through, that loop gets caught on my working thread and forms a little sort of oval shape, and then I can take my thread down at the edge. So let me try and do it where you're more likely to be able to see it. I wonder where it would work. Maybe you'll see it better on here. So put my thread through, taking it down, bringing it forward, pulling through to create my little eyelet, and then back down at the bottom. So I'll do it one more time. Let's try one down on this lighter fabric on the chiffon ribbon. Maybe that will help. So pull my thread through, back down where the thread's coming through, rock forward so the needle comes out inside the loop and pull. That creates a little oval teardrop shape, and then I can go down at the edge of the fabric. So that's another one that I like to do. Now what might be nice is to get some more shapely things silhouetted against the lighter fabric there. So what I'm going to do is use some fly stitch, but I'm going to do several fly stitches together. So I've got a dark navy perle. This is a variegated perle. Don't have a number for you, but it's a sort of navy blue with touches of a lighter blue. And I'm going to do a bunch of fly stitches worked quite close together. So there's my first one, and then I can go down a little way and rock my needle back up at the edge. So this is going to be like, I don't know, like a grassy seed head, I suppose. All invented foliage. This is all just imagined, an approximation of some foliage. And at the bottom I'm going to make a smaller one so it looks like it's tapering a little bit. Like that. And then I can take that down to the bottom, and if you want to you could put a little chain stitch at the top of that or whatever. I'm just going to put a little couching stitch on that because that's quite long. There we go. Let's have another one of those. Quite like it. So that gives you the idea. I'm going to put in some more of the background foliage and then we'll come back and start building forwards a bit. Okay, so I've put in some foreground detail. I've also put in a couple of patches of grass in the kind of middle distance there, just in amongst the water of the fields. I might do a bit more of that, but I want to see how it shapes up. So what I want to do now is trim my panel back so that I can add some binding. This isn't finished, but I want the binding on as the next stage. So I've got my rotary cutter here. You can do this just with scissors if you want to. And I've got my lines marked on that tell me where I want to go, where the limits of my panel are going to be. So what I'm going to do is line up my ruler with the line on my fabric, and I'm going to use my rotary cutter to just trim back my panel. I'm hoping this is going to square it off and not turn it into a really odd shape. So what I can do just to make sure it's going to be square is now line up the edges with my guidelines on my cutting mat. And that will help me to keep it all square. So I'm lining up that centre line on my ruler with the grid line on my cutting mat, this thicker grid line here. I'm matching that top and bottom. And that means that the edges of my panel are going to be right angles and it's not going to look really weird. So again, I'm going to line up with my cutting mat and then I can line up my edges. Like that. So now I've got a squared off panel, and I can bring my binding in. Now there's loads of different ways of doing this, please don't come for me. I'm just going to bring back in my ironing pad because I want to just do a little bit of work on my binding. At the moment it's folded in half, and what I want to do is fold it into the centre. So I'm just going to start it off like that, folding it into the centre, and then I fold it in half again. So I want a piece that is long enough to amply cover the long edge. So I'm just going to cut that. Now I could do this all in one piece, but I quite like the idea of having the joins on this piece. You don't have to, but if you want to bind it properly, I quite like the idea of having joins at the corners. So what I want to do, let's just move that up, is just iron that edge so that it is tucked in and join in the centre. And I'm going to do the same with the other edge. So I'm folding, I've got my strip. You can buy ready-made binding that will already have this done. This just happens to be some leftover binding that I had, so I'm just ironing along there, and then I want to fold it in half again and just set that fold along the edge like that. So now I can position my binding. I want it just like that, just sitting on my line, and I'm going to pin it. So I want to come up from the back and catch just that fold, just catching a tiny little bit of fabric, and then I want to hop over the edge and go just down through the backing fabric, and then I can slide my needle along and come out on that fold. So this is kind of like an applique stitch that I'm using. I'm not making them super close together. There's going to be more holding this down than just these stitches. I just want to tuck any ends of wool underneath, just from where the tree was attached. So now I'm past the tree, I should be able to go a bit faster. So now I'm going to take my needle through to the back, and I'm folding that up, and I'm going to work my way back along at the back just to catch that down on the reverse as well. And I don't have to be as cautious because I'm not worrying about keeping my stitches a secret on the back. So this one I can just scoot along without worrying too much. As long as it's flat, I don't mind. I do want to try and avoid going all the way through to the front, so I'm just scooping up a little bit of the wadding to catch this down. Okay, so I'm all the way along now, back and front, and I want to just trim this back to the edge of my panel. So I'm just going to snip that and snip that. Okay, so I'm going to repeat that at the top and then we'll do the sides. Okay, so I've got my top and my bottom done, and I've folded back some pieces for my sides, and what I want to do here is also, so I've folded them into the middle, folded it in half, but I also want to do a turn in like that. So I'm just going to press that very briefly in place because I want to be able to have a neat edge. So if you see now, I've got a neat edge on there, and I can tuck in my panel, just line that up with the edge, and I'm just going to pop a pin in there, and then I'm going to just go along almost to the edge, so I'm going to put another pin halfway along and then stitch down there, and just before the end there I'm going to fold my binding back so that that's a neat edge as well, and that will just be tucked in under there. So that's how I'm going to do it. Just needs a little bit more there. So I can pin that like that, and that will give me a neat edge. So I'm going to stitch that on, and then we'll come and add our embellishments and some extra stitching at the bottom. Okay, so here is my panel. Really liking what that's done. I think it's just a really nice frame to the piece. I think I'm really happy with it. So what we're going to do now is add some foreground details. So I've got some lighter threads out, and I've just selected a few beads and sequins and things like that. We're going to have a little play, and I want some of these details to overlap the border. That's why we put the border on first. So I'm going to use some of the same stitches but some different stitches as well, and I thought let's start over the border. So I've got some sort of duck egg. This is a Sheepy's thread. It's called Silver Green, shade 402. And let's start with just some little chain stitch details. So I'm going to come up in my border there, and I'm just going to put in, actually let's do some feather stitch because that's nice and it's similar to fly stitch. So just like fly stitch, I'm going to start by making my little V shape. But this time, rather than put in a stalk, I'm going to go off again over to the right and make another V straight away, like that. And then I'm going to go over to the left. Thread's a bit long here. And make another V. So rather than putting in anchor stitches or a vertical, I'm just making some interlocking V. So now I'm going back over to the right to make another V like that, and you don't have to do them all alternating, so I can go right again and then over to the left, and you can either keep going with your feather stitch all the way down to the bottom of your panel, or you can put a stalk on the bottom. So I think I'm going to go all the way down. I'm deliberately trying to make these a little bit uneven so that it's kind of organic looking. I don't want it to be too regular. So I'm just going to make that end at my binding, and then I hop over my last stitch and take it through to the back. So now I've got a little bit of foreground suddenly that leaps forward. So that's one of the stitches that we can do. So I've got some blue linen thread here, and I'm just going to put in another couple of my fly stitch seed heads. I can make these a bit bigger because they are meant to be further forward. So you want to play with scale as well as colour on this. So what I want to do is add some beads and sequins and things. So I'm just going to get some thread. I've got some silver grey perle here, and always good to check that your needle goes through. I'm fairly confident with these ones because they're so big. So what I want to do is knot my thread, and then I just want to think about where I want them. So I'm going to put some little kind of clusters of beads. So let's hook one of those. So I've come through from the back, I'm taking my needle through my bead, and then I'm going to take it back down through the fabric. And I can choose different beads. I've got a classy one here, that one won't go through. So let's just deal with these chunky ones first. And put another one just dropping down onto my border. I quite like that these look like water droplets as well. So you've got that. Oh, there's a funny shaped one there. I'm not going to worry about that because I quite like the difference that it adds. Let's put two there. So I just want to sort of scatter them about, and we're going to add some more stitches. Now I've added 6 beads there. I'm going to actually knot at the back, and that way if my thread should break, I only lose those 6 beads, I don't lose them all. So I'm actually going to trim my thread there because I want a bit of a gap off. So that's our first little set of beads. I'm going to put some smaller beads on now. So I'm going to bring through and just pick up, these are sort of silver lined glass beads, these are much smaller. So I'm just going to dot some of these around. Don't have that many of these, so I'm going to be kind of cautious. And I can go, because these are much smaller, I can go higher up. They almost look like drops of dew or droplets of water that are caught on the foliage. So I can dot these around wherever I like, really. They're kind of on the wrong side for me. I'll just pick up a bit of light here and there. So I can cluster them with the other beads that I've got as well. Like that. Let's just work on this section because I'm going to do the same kind of thing over here, so rather than constantly leaning over. So I've got a bit of white thread here, and I just want to show you a way of using sequins. So you can, I've got some lovely blue metallic sequins here, so you can use French knots to secure them in place. So I've just threaded through the needle, I've pulled the thread towards me, I'm sitting my needle on top, and I'm going to wrap over the top a few times, and then I'm going to go back down through the hole, and that brings my knot across the hole, and so I've got a sequin in place there with a little French knot, and so that it doesn't look really odd, it's always good to do a bit of a scattering of French knots around. So there are going to be some French knots on this piece as well, so I can be quite playful. The trick with the French knot is to keep your thread under tension. So as you're going back through the fabric, just pull on the thread so that the wraps drop down to the fabric, and then keep that thread under tension until the last minute, and that will allow you to settle your French knot neatly on the surface. So you can put in, I want to put another sequin in like that. So another thing I'm going to do just to add some texture are some loopy knots. Now I quite like a colonial knot for this, so very similar to a French knot, sometimes known as a figure 8 knot. So you start it in the same way. I've got my needle pulling the thread towards me, but this time instead of wrapping over the top, I'm going to start by scooping that thread. So thread towards me, needle in my dominant hand, and I'm going to scoop, take my needle over the thread and scoop it like that, and then I'm going to wrap it. So I'm going to wrap it 3 times, and I'm not going to make it, I'm not going to pull it so that the wraps rest on the surface. I'm just going to go straight through, and that will pull my thread into a knot that has a loop. Hopefully you can see that. And when these are clustered together, they can look just lovely. So I'll show you that again. Pull my thread through, I'm taking my needle over the top and back underneath, and then I'm going to wrap a few times. I'm not going to pull it tight, I'm just going to take it back through. And I'm doing this with variegated because I'm hoping that this will just sort of fade from one colour to another as I move across. I'm going to get some other colours in as well. So I'm going to build up the areas around here in that way, just adding some sequins and beads, some loopy knots in my lighter colours of thread, and then I'll come back and the last thing we're going to do is add the rain. So I'm going to do that and I'll be back shortly. Okay, so here we are. I've put in all my stitching and beads at the front, and I will put in some close-up photos. So all I want to do now is put in my rain, and I'm tentative because I'm never fully convinced by this ever. I've got a single strand of my metallic because I want to balance out some of the sparkle that's down here with some sparkle at the top. So I'm never convinced this looks right, but I'm just going to go for it. So I've got a bit of my blue metallic, and what I don't want is to make it look too wild. I think there's quite a lot of stillness in this scene. So what I want to do is maybe actually some markers are going to help me a little bit, just so that everything is following a similar line. So I'm using my heat erase to put some lines on, just to give me a bit of a guide. I want them to be at a similar angle. So I'm using my quilting ruler to put in some guidelines. I don't want to overdo this, but let's start there and see what happens. So I just want to put in some running stitches, and I want them to be slightly different lengths, different distances apart, and I'm hoping that's going to give me a sense of rain. So I want them to be regular, because I don't think raindrops are all exactly the same size. Some are going to go over my owl and some won't. But I don't want my owl to be completely obscured. So this is just running stitches that I'm keeping a little bit irregular, and I'm trying to use that line that I've just drawn as a bit of a guideline. Just help me get roughly the same angle. It doesn't have to be exact. So this is going to also help quilt together the background a little bit. So here's our finished January panel. We've got our watery sky, we've got a hint at some rain, and we've got our owl, our printed owl, and we've got our couched tree, and then we've got all our wet and icy looking foliage down at the bottom. So that's it for January. I really hope you've enjoyed the process of making that over a number of weeks, and I hope that it's given you some moments each week to just focus on some stitch and a bit of creativity and maybe a bit of mindfulness. So yeah, thanks so much for joining me. If you haven't already voted, there are some options on my community tab on my channel where you can influence my decision about colour scheme for our February piece. And yeah, I can't wait to see your completed January landscapes. Have a play with some of the stitches that we've explored. Add in your beads and sequins, and you can choose to border it, or you can do something completely different. So I hope you'll join me again in February, where we're going to make something very different. And yeah, thanks so much for watching. If you've enjoyed this, I will link some videos here and here so that you can get on with your next project while you're waiting for our February piece. Have a great week. Can't wait to see what you post on our Facebook group, and I will see you soon. Bye.